I've been a fan of Sidney Saylor Farr's for a long time. Many years ago, dear friend Rooney and Marilyn Floyd, dear friends, they purchased her book More Than Moonshine for me and sent it to me as a gift. They both enjoy my blog and support the things that I do as far as Celebrating Appalachia goes, and they just thought that was a book I should have for my collection. I had never heard of the book before they sent it. I immediately fell in love with it. Now, it's a cookbook, but along with all the great recipes, it has a lot of stories that really just immediately I loved. I loved the way that she wrote. I loved the things that she talked about. Especially interesting to me since I'm from Western North Carolina. Her husband was from the Western North Carolina area, so she was from the Berea area of Kentucky, so in addition to kind of that influence, it also had the influence of her husband of Western North Carolina. So if you don't have that book, that's my favorite Appalachian cookbook, so you should definitely look for it. But once I had it and I read it and I tried to find out more about her, I discovered she had other books. So one of those other books is My Appalachia, which is a memoir by Sidney Saylor Farr, and that's my next book that I'm going to be reading. So we're going to start today just with the very beginning of the book, the first chapter, and I hope you like it as much as you have the other books that I've read. And then at the end, as usual, once I do my reading for today, we'll kind of talk about the things that jumped out of the book to me, and then hopefully you'll leave a comment and share the things that kind of pricked your mind or that you thought about when you heard what I read. Number 1, this is chapter 1, beginning. There is no place in the world where I would rather spend a year than in the mountains of southeast Kentucky. I believe that each of us is a link between the past and the future, and that it is our duty to pass along family history, otherwise legends, stories, songs, and traditions will be lost. I want my story to reveal past events that affected the lives of my people and me. By the time my father was a young man, most of the cleared fields on Stony Fork, Kentucky, where he and his family lived, were worn out, and new ground constantly had to be cleared for corn. Dad courted and married Mama in 1930. She was from Laurel Fork in Leslie County, Kentucky. He built a log cabin on Coon Branch at the head of Stony Fork, just over the hill from Grandpa. 2 years later, on October 30th, 1932, I was born in that cabin. I have since learned that 1930 was known as the year of the drought. People were starving because of the scarcity of crops and wild game. The first charity my family ever took was when the Red Cross came in with food to help during the drought. Wild game, groundhog, possum, and coon, was very scarce, but Dad loved to hunt and managed to keep meat on the table. Mama baked possum when there was no other fresh meat, though I never learned to like it. The men of Stony Fork loved to go hunting in the autumn, especially for coon. Right about the time the leaves started falling, the men hit the hills after dark with a pack of dogs 2 or 3 nights a week on school days and stayed out till maybe 11 p.m. On Friday and Saturday nights, they might not get home before daybreak. They scoured the hills for good places to hunt. They went out in small groups of 4 or 5 hunters at most and usually came home with just an unlucky possum or 2. They carried carbide lights to light their way through the woods, but they also had at least one serious flashlight which never got turned on unless they needed to see if a coon was up a tree. That flashlight with 2 batteries would usually last all season. On the rare occasions when they did take a coon, the owner of the tree and dog got to keep the hide. He would display it on the side of a smokehouse or any place else it could be seen, much the same way you see deer heads mounted in sporting goods stores. The man whose dog treed a coon would be locally famous for a while, and he would be offered a higher price for his coon dog. A raccoon tasted better than no meat at all, but it was stringy and tough. Coons were so scarce that eating one was a novelty. A lean groundhog, on the other hand, taken early in spring before it started fattening up on weeds and tasting like whatever it was eating, could weigh up to 20 or 25 pounds and cooked up sweet and tender. I loved groundhog the way my mother fixed it. She first parboiled the pieces of meat with the broken limbs of a spice bush, then placed the meat in a baking pan. Around the meat, she wedged quartered sweet potatoes, then spooned bacon fat over the meat and potatoes, poured into a cup of water, and baked it in the oven. Served with cornbread, it made a delicious meal. Groundhogs were good for more than just their meat. If you scraped and tanned the hide properly, you could sell it to be used as a resonator head for a 5-string banjo. It would stretch tighter than anything made of synthetic material. My family lived as far back in the hollers as it was possible to go in Bell County, Kentucky. Dad worked in the timber woods and at a sawmill when there was employment to be found. We ate what we grew on our land or could glean from the hillsides. Just about everything was made by hand. We had little contact with people outside our region. There were no newspapers and no radio in our house. Every 2 years, a new baby was born in our family. I helped with the cooking, washing, cleaning, and milking, and I took care of the younger children when Mama went to dig roots in the hills or hoe corn in the fields. I remember a time when I was 3 years old and Mama went to the field to help Dad hoe corn. She spread a quilt in a shady place and left me to care for Della, who was not a year old. My little sister was crawling by this time, and I had a hard time keeping her on the quilt. By the time Della, Hazel, and Clara had followed me, Dad had just about given up hope that he would ever have a son. But then 3 boys came along, one every 2 years. The firstborn became Dad's pride and joy. Mama wanted to name him after her only living brother, Dewey. Dad wanted to name his first son for his favorite uncle, James. I never understood why they didn't compromise by giving him both names. However, the birth certificate recorded his legal name as Dewey Saylor. But from day one, Dad called him James, and soon the rest of us, except Mama, took up the name. For mountain people who softened their words, James was pronounced Jeems, and Clara became Clary. It was easier to say Clary than it was to say Clara, and Jeems than James. Dad took Jeems with him everywhere he went, even to the moonshine still. This worried Mama, but she didn't try to stop him. 2 years after Jeems was born, another boy came along. He was named Fred. 2 years after that, the third and last son, Leroy, was born. Then Mama gave birth to 3 other girls, Minnie, Lola, and Sharon Rose. The day brother Fred was born, Dad took the midwife, whom we called Aunt Mary, home just after dinner. He was not back by supper time, and Mama began to worry. "Surely to goodness he won't get drunk today," she said. "Surely to goodness he won't stop at Cal Brock's store and start drinking." I washed the supper dishes, milked the cow, and fed the chickens and hogs before dark. I put the children to bed in the next room and then lay down on a pallet near Mama's bed. Sometime in the night she called me. "I hear your dad, Sidney. It sounds like he's down near the barn. You'll have to take a lantern and go get him." "I don't want to go down that road by myself, Mama. If you don't go, then I'll have to get up from this bed and go myself," she said. "We can't leave him down there all night." I got up, fixed the lantern, and went down the road. Dad had fallen off his horse, which was standing patiently by. I looped the reins over the horse's head, slapped his rump, and told him to go home. "Dad, let me help you up," I said. He staggered up and walked a few feet, then stopped. "Why did you let her go away?" he demanded. "I'll never see her again, and she had the prettiest yellow hair." He began to cry. Eventually, with Dad staggering, falling, and crying, we got to the front porch where he puked, splattering his shoes. Then he fell down and passed out. I brought out a quilt to spread over him, then went to unsaddle and feed the horse. Early the next morning, Dad awoke and went to bed. I scrubbed the porch before the children got up. Everyone in our community was poor. If it had not been for the small farms and gardens, domestic animals, and wild game brought in from the hills, our people would have starved. But they planted corn and raised gardens, chicken, and livestock. They picked fruit and berries, canned and preserved as much food as they could for winter, and made do with what they had. Dad and Mama dug ginseng and other roots which they dried and sold by the pound in the late fall. For a number of years, Dad made and sold moonshine whiskey. He was skilled at castrating domestic animals, and the neighbors hired him to perform the service for their hogs, horses, bull calves, and so forth. With money coming in small payments for the castrations, the roots and herbs, the dozen or so eggs sold each week, the occasional gallon of milk or blackberries sold or exchanged for groceries, we managed. I often think of how close we lived to pioneer days in the 1940s and 1950s. We lagged behind the times in southern Appalachia, at least 50 to 75 years in some regions and 100 years in others. Still, despite my growing up in the mountains of southeastern Kentucky, I had several role models, some in my extended family, others among my neighbors. No one ever told us we were Appalachians, a poor, benighted people, so we did not have that in our consciousness. We shared with our neighbors when Dad planned to butcher a hog. He would send word to neighbors up and down the creek that they should come by the next day for a mess of meat. They did come, and Dad would take meat to the older people, and there would be feasting everywhere as families cooked the fresh pork. When our neighbors butchered, they did the same. Mountain people shared everything. They were my teachers, especially the women. I didn't know it at the time, but what they gave me was exactly what I would need one day to write. Some were storytellers. We lived near Granny Brock, my dad's grandmother, from the time I was 5 until I was 12 years old. It was said in the family that Granny Brock had 7 husbands, some still living, others long gone, but no one knew any personal information about any of them. Her last husband, Andrew Brock, was the only one we knew. Her first child was Dad's mother. It was said of both Granny Brock and Grandma Saylor, my paternal grandmother, that they were 2 of the most beautiful women in Bell County. I remember Grandma's black hair and her classic cheekbones and sculptured face. Granny Brock was tiny, less than 5 feet tall, and her beauty was a dark radiance of hair and eyes. Granny Brock was an independent woman who knew her own mind. She didn't seem to care what other people thought of her. She just did what had to be done to survive. Something about her influenced my love for words. Her language was descriptive with vivid words and symbols. All of my people talked that way. I always thought it came from our Scots-Irish ancestry. Granny had weathered incredible storms during her lifetime, but she laughed a lot. She told me stories of pioneer days, how when she was young, a bad blizzard hit. Another time, a bear tried to get into their log house. It circled the house again and again, snuffling and growling, trying to get in. She told of how her mother sat up all night to protect her children. She spoke of husbands who came and went, and about her children who stayed and had to be fed, especially little Mike. She said, "I did the best that I could for all of them." Mike was my little crippled boy, Granny said. She spoke of the night he was born, a night when it snowed so long and hard that even the fence posts were buried in the snow. The midwife had a hard time getting to her, and Mike had a hard time getting born. When he did come, his little feet and legs were all twisted. Granny Brock said she cried that whole night through, and many other times too. Since Mike couldn't run and play, he invented games and made up little songs to amuse himself. One that Granny shared with me was about planting corn in the springtime. When the whippoorwills call, it's corn planting time. When the whippoorwills call, it's corn planting time. I asked Granny many times to talk about little Mike and other things in her life, as I sat next to her, loving the story and loving her. Little Mike lived to be 8-year-old when the good Lord just took him home. It was a night almost as bad as the night he was born. It snowed and the wind kept blowing and the cold creeped in. I tried to keep him warm as I could, but I reckon an angel came down on that snowfall and carried him away. When Granny would tell me sad stories like this, we would sit and not say another word for a long time. Then she would brighten up and tell me something funny or risque stories about some of the older folks who lived up and down the creeks, stories that horrified my mother and taught me to hold my tongue. Some of my happiest memories are when Dad and Granny Brock went fishing in the evenings and Mama allowed me to go with them. I loved to listen to the stories they told. Granny did most of the talking. "Now, Wilburn," she would say to my father, "do you remember old Willie Simpson? Now, there was a slick, sharp man. They warn't nothing he couldn't connive at doing." "Yeah," Dad would agree. "Remember the time he stole corn from Old Man Asher's corn crib?" "Willie Simpson spotted Old Man Asher stealing corn from a corn crib down the creek," Granny said. "Willie followed the man back to his corn crib and watched him dump in the corn. Willie waited until Asher went back for a second load, then filled his own sack and took the corn home. I reckon Old Man Asher carried stolen corn and dumped it into his own corn crib all night long. But come daylight, he couldn't see any of it in his crib." Dad laughed. "No," Granny joined his laughter, "because it was all in Willie Simpson's corn crib." Then Dad and Granny would fish a while in silence until one of them remembered another story. I'd sit and listen to them until the moon was high in the sky. I had the good fortune to spend hours with Granny Brock, especially nights and weekends. Her house was on the way home from the one-room school I attended, and I usually stopped for a visit. Often she would tell me to look in the warming closet of her wood-burning stove and I would find something to eat. Usually it was a baked sweet potato. How I wish I could have tape-recorded Granny's stories. Here are some snippets as close to being in her own words as I can remember. "Before I was ever married, I fell in love with an Asher man. He promised to marry me, but then took up with another girl and married her. I was pregnant by that time, but I did not tell him. I had a girl child, named her Susie. She's your grandma. They's a place called Dark Holler. Who can say why it's called that? I reckon they was dark deeds done there in days gone by. But that's where they buried my Joe and little Mike. My first husband died young. He got lung fever and seemed like no time at all. Then Joe was gone. That left me with no one to help me. My kinfolk had all died out, not meaning, of course, them in the old country. Some folks said what I done was wrong, and maybe it was, but I reckon the good Lord will take everything and add it up and judge me a fair judgment. I'm a-counting on that. I never slept with a neighbor woman's husband. It was mostly traveling men passing through Cumberland Gap, and them in the community with no women of their own. They give me food and clothes for little Mike and me. Little Mike, Lordy, he had the prettiest yellow hair and sky blue eyes. I can see him plain as day sometimes, though it's been 60 years now since he died. Sometime after that, I don't know how long it was, but I recall the cornstalks were goldy colored. I married Jake Howard, and we moved to Renfro Valley. But we just got settled when a train killed Jake, and I had to come back home. I don't deny a thing I've ever done. I never was one to prettify up a picture to make out like I was better than I am. It was lonesome, and Susie and I still had to eat. The next man I married was Jim Farmer. Jim was plumb foolish about Susie, but she was a wild one, I'm here to tell you. Guess she took after her mother. But I didn't worry about her too much. I always say, give a wild girl a good man. Why, it's like honeybees. Take wild bees out of a bee tree and put 'em in a good hive, and they'll tame down right quick. Susie married Sidney Saylor when she was just 15. He built her a house up on Peach Orchard. He squared the logs and rived the boards himself. He was a good man, and Susie tamed down quick. They had a passel of boys. Wilburn, my father, Sidney Saylor Farr's father, Squire, Otis, Andrew, Willie B., and 2 girls, Betty and Laura. And Susie was still the prettiest woman in all of Bell County. Why, people from near and far, strangers passing through Cumberland Gap, talked about how beautiful she was. I'm proud to say your grandma was a virgin when she married Solomon Saylor. Jim said he'd druther Sol would build his house near us. I told him, life's not druthers. If and you'd get to thinking it is, I told him, just you study the acorns under that oak tree out there, all raring to be giant oak trees, and how many do, I told him. If I could have had my druthers, if I had my Jode sleep beside me every night. Little Mike could have grandchildren now. If life was all druthers, there'd be no graves up in Dark Holler. Dark Holler, I don't rightly know how it got its name, but come every spring and the wild honeysuckle lights up the place real pretty. I started writing stories and poems a decade later, and it seemed only natural when Granny's voice appeared in my poems. Aunt Deli, who was married to Dad's brother Otis, was a reader, and she introduced me to stories in books. A young woman with black hair, brown eyes, and the whitest teeth I ever saw. Aunt Deli was probably part Cherokee, as were many of the folks around our part of the land. Her adopted father and mother lived near Pineville, and sometimes they got discarded books from the town library for Aunt Deli. She read every one of them and then gave the book to me. One book I will never forget was the Book of Mormon. It confused and frightened me. When I asked Aunt Deli what it meant, she confessed that she did not understand it either. It did not seem a bit odd to either of us that we had read every word of that book in spite of our confusion, for we both loved the printed word. It was through Aunt Deli that I got to read Little Women, Heidi, Pilgrim's Progress, Lorna Dunn, Gone with the Wind, and other classics. Aunt Betty and Aunt Laura, my dad's sisters, taught me about nature and the imagination. 2 lessons that I'm not sure you can ever really learn inside the walls of a classroom. Aunt Betty was 13 years older than I, but we were friends. She was a big, strong woman who cut down trees and sawed them into logs for firewood, repaired fences and roofs, and performed other kinds of outdoor work. Aunt Betty was a loner. She never much wanted to go out where there were crowds of people. She taught me to recognize varieties of trees and what kind of mass they produced. She taught me to know about ginseng. Together we dug roots and gathered wild herbs, which she dried to sell in late autumn for cash. We gathered wild greens in early spring, bringing home tiny spears of poke. Whenever Aunt Betty talked about something, she always related it to nature. She would say, "That was when a fire burned on Black Mountain," or "That was just after the corn was laid by last summer." In a way, Aunt Betty taught me about metaphors. Three helicopters interrupted my reading. Sorry about that. Aunt Laura, Dad's youngest sister, was reckless and wildly imaginative. I remember when I was 4 and she was just 8 years old. One weekend we were in Grandpa's barn playing in the hay. She rolled down the side of a pile of hay and fell through an open place in the floor. I started to cry for fear she was killed. The lower part of the barn was open on either end, and one of Grandpa's big hogs had wandered in to sleep in the shade. Aunt Laura landed on the pig's back. "Well, shoot, pig," she said. "I've done and killed you." I laughed so hard I nearly fell after her. Aunt Laura's imagination was as wild as her physical recklessness. We romped in the woods and would go to Gum Spring around the hillside where we got our drinking water. Gum Spring was made into a hospital in our imagination. 2 tall trees grew near the spring. These were the doctor and the nurse in our fantasy. The smaller bushes were patients. Aunt Laura was the voice for it all. As the doctor, she diagnosed dreadful diseases for all of us. For me, the doctor prescribed a gallon a day of Grandma Saylor's bitters, which Grandma brewed every winter and insisted that we all drink every time we got near her kitchen. I cried when I had to drink the bitter brew. From Aunt Laura, I learned to be adventurous and reckless about my physical safety. Climbing trees, rooftops, and high rocks. I learned to be creative by listening to the imaginary people and situations she introduced me to in the woods and in the playhouses. My mother was another creative force in my life, but her brand of creativity was somehow a little different than Aunt Laura's. I always saw it coupled with frugality and hard work, and I came to understand that imagination lived side by side with both these things. My mother had a big family to care for and no time or energy to create pretty and frivolous things, but she found a way to satisfy her creative yearnings by the patterns she chose to use, the color of her materials, and the tiny stitches in her quilting. She planted flowers in cans and boxes and filled our yard and front porch with colorful blooms. Certainly my mother had a green thumb. She could make anything flourish and grow. After I married and left home, many times she would visit, taking home with her slips and cuttings of my plants. Months or years later, I would go to her house to get new cuttings and start over, while hers seemed to live on and on. Nothing ever died under her care. I don't remember my mother ever having an idle time. Besides keeping the house and children as clean as possible, she worked in the garden and picked berries from the hillsides during the summer. In winter, when the weather was right, she made hominy and lye soap. I hated soap making. I especially hated the smell of the cakes of lye soap. I used to dream of having a whole wash tub of pretty, nice-smelling soap. When I grow up and have my own home, I will never make lye soap, I declared. I will buy pretty soap that smells good. My mother smiled and with a twinkle in her eye said, "If you have enough money to buy things like that, why then I reckon you won't ever have to make your own soap." But Mama always knew more than she ever said. I would make poems instead of soap much of my adult life, but the lessons of my mother I took with me. First chapter. And even that one makes me emotional, makes me get teary-eyed. Really love Sidney Saylor Farr, so I hope you enjoyed this part. Some of the things that jumped out at me, the very first little line that she says, let me go back and read it. Just as each little chapter has a little piece of text at the beginning, kind of like I don't know what you call that, there's a literary term, but any kind of right below the title, which is beginning, is where she had, "There is no place in the world where I would rather spend a year than the mountains of southeast Kentucky." So I love that part. Not that I would rather be in southeast Kentucky, but for me, there's no place in the world that I would rather spend a year than in western North Carolina, than right here where I'm at in Brasstown. I read a story, or I don't even know if it was a story, if it was in a book, if it was somebody telling it, I can't remember, but years and years ago that stuck with me. And it was about an older woman who'd grew up in the mountains of Appalachia. She had a lot of kids, maybe 7 or 8 kids, and she was proud. They had all went to not just to high school, they'd went to college, and they'd got jobs, and they'd spread out. And a lot of them loved to travel. And once they had the means to travel, they begged her to go with them. You know, "Mom, we're going to Europe," or "We're going to, one of the parks out west," or Arizona, or the Grand Canyon, or whatever it was. And she never wanted to go, and they couldn't understand why. But she said, "I'm happy where I'm at, and I just don't need to see all that. I'm just happy." Now, I'm not against traveling by any means. If people that love to travel, in my life, I've never had the financial ability to travel very much. But it's not something I've mourned over, I guess is what I'm saying. Like that woman and like Sidney Saylor Farr, I'm happy with my lot. I'm happy where I'm at. I love where I'm at. So yes, it's wonderful. I love to go to the beach. That's about as far as I travel. But I'm very satisfied with where I live. So I like that kind of introduction into the book. The part about the coon hunting, I liked that part because I grew up in a family of coon hunters. My uncles, but mostly my Papa Wade and my cousins, my brother Steve, they loved to coon hunt when I was a girl. Now, things were different. There was way more coons than when Sidney Saylor Farr's talking about. They were really scarce. They were not that scarce, and they're certainly not now. Not as many coon hunters today in my area, though. But all of Papa's dogs, I remember the dog boxes, the way he would call them, the way, you could, in the night you could hear them go up. They'd go up. There's an old roadbed on the other side of the ridge there, and you could hear them, and you could see the lights going and hear the dogs going, and hear the dogs treat, all those kind of things. So all those bring back wonderful, wonderful memories to me for sure. And the part about her having to watch the kids, which, there's a tinge of sadness there, especially the part about having to go after her father, that was heartbreaking. But the part about her putting her sister on the quilt reminded me of a story I heard my whole life about Pap. He was the oldest in his family, and then there was a brother after him, a sister, and then the last brother, Uncle Henry. And when his sister was a baby, one time, just over that road I was talking about, on over the other side of it, over in Pinhook, they lived over there, and his mother put Carrie on, that was his sister, on a blanket and told Pap that he better watch her. Well, he didn't watch her, and she got off the blanket and got rocks and was eating rocks, and she was just, a little bitty baby. probably couldn't even walk yet, but she could crawl enough to go get the rocks. And Daddy said they would tease about it, and tease between him and Carrie or whatever, but he remembered the whipping he got. That was one of the worst ones he ever got, and it was because he didn't watch his little sister. It was his job to watch her, and he didn't watch her, and she could have got hurt. Thankfully she didn't, but it reminded me of that. And that her talking about her father, which that's so sad that she had to go get him and take care of him. That's just heartbreaking, and I would never want nobody to go through that. But then the other parts that she talks about, the people that were an example to her life, I think that's really powerful. I know in my life, we all have hardships. There's hardships. But if you can look to somebody that has a hardship and actually overcomes it and somehow soldiers on and does the right thing, that's really inspiring. It's inspiring if you don't even know the person. But if it's someone in your family and you can really connect to that. Like I've used that before in my life. When I was going through a hard time, I would think about the hard times. I'd think about the times that Pap told me stories and, the things that he had told me that was really hard on him growing up or in his adult life, but how he pushed through that with the good Lord's help, of course, and then how that, made you stronger. So I would think about that, or I would think about my Papa Wade. His mother died when he was 12 years old. There was a baby, Aunt Hazel, that was 6 months old, and what a trauma that had to be for their family, but how they all went on. They all soldiered on. I think that's really powerful things. And as I said, it is, even if you just pick up a book and read it or hear a story on the internet or something like that, but those family connections are so important for that. And how you have that is passing down those wonderful stories. Appalachians are natural born storytellers. Pretty much from when they're 5 years old, they're telling stories. And a lot of times those stories might be about Granny or Papa or whatever they've told them that happened, before this little grandchild was ever even thought of. I have stories like that are dear to my heart that happened way before I was ever even born or thought of. So I think there's real power in that real inspiration. I really love that part, and I think that's what she was trying to say, that those elders taught her to soldier on and to do what she had to do, like taking care of her daddy so that her mama wouldn't have to get up when she just had a baby. And then the part, her grandma, of course, you can tell is one of those elders that was influenced. The part that she said about the oak tree, that I liked all the stuff that the grandmother said. So the part, I liked everything that she said, but the part where she's talking about the druthers, if you had your druthers. So she said, she told Jim, said he'd druther, because Sol, the new son-in-law, he would druther them live close to him. And she said, I told him life's not about druthers. If you get to thinking it is, I told him, just you study the acorns under that oak tree out there, all raring to be giant oak trees. See how many do, I told him. So I think that's really wise. I like that. I really liked that part too, how she was looking at nature and using that as an example, something that she's seen. This year, the mast around our house, the acorns, is amazingly large. It is, not saying what that means, if that means a bad winter or what, but it is amazingly large. And just like she said, out of all those acorns that are falling, squirrels are going crazy eating them, deer are eating them, but how many of them are actually going to grow to be as big as the oak tree that dropped them? That's just something really deep that you could think about for a long time. So I hope you enjoyed this first part of the book as much as I did. Please leave a comment and tell me what jumped out at you, if anything. And I hope you'll drop back by next Friday, because now we've got to see what happens in Sidney Saylor Farr's life next.